You'll recall that on Wednesday we began talking about the Jerusalem Council. Our narrative was interrupted as we celebrated yesterday's feast day, so we missed some of the key elements in the council. So let's go back and take a look at what was happening during the Jerusalem Council. The Jerusalem Council had been called on to decide on the question of whether or not Gentile converts to the faith needed to observe certain ceremonial aspects of the law, such as circumcision. The text we would have read yesterday talks about how there was the testimony at the council. So Peter got up and he began talking about how he had gone to the Gentile home and he'd preached the gospel and the Holy Spirit came on them just like he had on them at the beginning. We talked about that when we reviewed Acts chapter 11. Then after them, Paul and Barnabas got up and they began talking about how they'd been preaching the gospel in various places and the Gentiles had been believing. And then James gets up and he summarizes the arguments that have been made in the discussion. Now James, at that point, is the Bishop of Jerusalem. And so since they're having the council in Jerusalem, he's kind of the moderator, if you will, of that conversation. And so they come up with a summary and then they have it written down in a letter. And then that letter is going to be sent out to all of the churches to tell them what the council decided. This is exactly what we still do. We still have councils and then there's kind of a summary of that. Those get written into documents, and those become the documents of that council. So when we talk about, for instance, what happened at Vatican II, and we read Vatican II documents, that's what we're reading. We're not necessarily reading all of the discussion that took place. We're reading the final decisions and what they came to in that council. So this resulted in a letter summarized the decision, and then it went out. Now, in verse 22 of this passage in Acts chapter 15, part of what's written in the letter is this. It says, since we have heard that some of our number who went out without any mandate from us that they've upset you and that their teachings have disturbed your peace of mind. So here's the idea. Notice that they emphasize that the teachers who started this, the Judaizers, if you will, they didn't have any mandate from the apostles. They didn't have any direct authority to be teaching what they were teaching. And you know what? It's still the same in the church today. The church still has authorized teachers of the faith. Obviously the clergy, the Holy Father, bishops, priests, deacons, but then lay people as well, catechists in various capacities. The church typically has a way of either ordaining or commissioning people to teach, and then a process by which we maintain, people are still teaching the right stuff and all of that. If you're ever hearing people teach something that doesn't sound quite right, you might want to check into it a little bit because they may not have a mandate. They may not have authorization to be teaching what they're doing. And even if they do, and they're teaching something contrary to the faith, then they're teaching outside of authority because they're not teaching what the church has to say. So those are some of the precedents that were set at the council. What was the decision of the council? What did they arrive at? They called us to abstain from 4 things. Listen to what they were. Abstain from meat sacrificed to idols. Abstain from blood, meaning drinking blood. Abstain from the meat from strangled animals. And abstain from sexual immorality. Now, if you're saying to yourself, that sounds a little strange. Well, the reason for that is because the first 3 of those things were kind of temporary stipulations that the church later changed. And the reason was because those things were things that were being typically practiced by Gentiles that were particularly offensive to Jews. And so the council realized that while we aren't going to put the obligation of keeping the ceremonial law on the Gentiles, we still need to be sure that we can have unity, and so we need to make sure that things aren't happening that are innately offensive to some of the Jews in the group. This shows the wisdom of the church and the pastoral nature of the church. That it's it's just like a parent. You've got to come up with a reasonable compromise so that everybody can live together in peace. So the first 3 had to do with particular pagan ceremonies that were later changed by the church. The last one was something that was more enduring, and in fact it still endures to the present day, that there are various forms of sexual immorality that we need to abstain from. And that applies to all Christians, whether Jews or Gentiles. Now, the church doesn't just simply change doctrine. Doctrine remains the same. But the church, as a good mother, does guide us in how to apply the doctrine, whether things we should do or things we should refrain from doing. And it has the authority to change those depending on time and culture. Once a particular stipulation has been removed, it's no longer really an issue, then the church really has the authority to change that. And I think that's something that's really great about being part of the Catholic Church. It's a living entity, and it's able to guide us on matters like this. It helps us with making the applications in our own times. There's really a lot more that I could say about the wisdom of the church in selecting the means of a council to make decisions such as these. For one thing, they allow the church to consider the full gamut of the issues involved and hear from a variety of opinions. But in the end, when the consensus of the council is reached and the Holy Father has approved its conclusions, then it's time for us to come together in unity and begin living in light of the decisions that were reached by the council. A decision that, in the words of Acts 15, is the decision of the Holy Spirit and of us.